Coming up, Trump is now certified. He is in, and the Democrats are out. The official transition is January 20th, but the certification happened today. I'll reflect on the momentous significance of January 6th, 2025, by also flashing back to January 6th, 2021. And former FBI official and terrorism expert John Guandolo joins me. We're going to talk about ISIS in America and the broader threat of terrorism in America. Hey, if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, listening on Apple, Google, or Spotify, please subscribe to my channel. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
America needs this voice. The times are crazy. In a time of confusion, division, and lies, we need a brave voice of reason, understanding, and truth. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
Just a few minutes ago, Donald Trump was certified officially as the 47th president of the United States. Just a momentous development, one that would seem far-fetched, even impossible, not just 4 years ago on January 6th of 2021, but maybe even a year ago, maybe even 9 months ago. This would have seemed like a very tall hill to climb. And yet here we are. I want to talk about the significance of this kind of January 6th of 21 versus January 6th of 25. Before I do, just a couple of thoughts about this past weekend. Debbie and I made our way to Washington, D.C., and it was really fun. We were just there for Brandon Gill's swearing in, and there was a good deal of anticipation, not because of Brandon per se, but because of the selection of the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Now, we got to sit in the gallery, Debbie and I did. It's a very small kind of room with all the congressmen sitting on the main floor, and then a relatively small number of people up in the gallery getting a bird's eye view, so to speak, of what's going on. And so I was there for the first round of voting, Mike Johnson versus Hakeem Jeffries. And initially, for a moment, I felt that kind of strange feeling like, could Hakeem Jeffries possibly win the vote? Particularly because I saw one after the other some House Republicans voting against Johnson. Now, they didn't vote for Jeffries, but they would vote for Boehner, or not Boehner, they would vote for Tom Emmer, or they'd vote for somebody else. Yeah, they voted for Boehner. They'd have to be immediately put into a straitjacket and carried out. But nevertheless, I thought it possible that Hakeem Jeffries could have gone over the top. Then, of course, I thought about it and I realized, no, there's no way Hakeem Jeffries can become the Speaker. The Republicans have a majority, and so no Republican, at least no sane Republican, is going to vote for a Democrat to be the Speaker. So the only question is, will Mike Johnson make it? And if not, will some other Republican, will the process drag itself out? Well, as it turns out, Trump himself intervened. And so there were some holdouts. Keith Self from Texas, I believe, was one. Ralph Norman, I believe from Oklahoma, was another. Of course, the redoubtable Thomas Massie, who is almost immovable on these things. I mean, this is the one guy where it doesn't matter if Trump calls, he's not going to do it, because the way he looks at it, he's a man of principle, and he's just not going to bend. Fortunately, Mike Johnson could afford to lose that vote, but he couldn't afford to lose any other votes. And so sure enough, Trump's on the phone, apparently from the golf course, telling Keith Self, hey, listen, I need you to vote for Johnson. Why? Because we may not have what you consider to be the ideal team. By the way, this is also my view. But nevertheless, we need to have a team. Politics is fought in teams. We're going to have legislation. We need it to move through the House. And the truth of it is that while Mike Johnson may not be, as I mentioned, the ideal guy, he's probably the only guy who can make it at this point. There may be other guys in theory who are better, but there is no way they would command a majority of the votes. Whereas here's Mike Johnson. He's 2 votes away from having that required majority, and so Norman and Self kind of relented, and we now have Speaker Mike Johnson. So we went to the swearing in. Brandon had a terrific party afterward at a nice cafe. By the way, it was really amazing because a huge horde of Texans from Brandon's district showed up. They were in his office in the day, they were watching on TV, and then they came to the reception in the evening. And this is actually quite unusual. I mean, it's normal for new congressmen to have some family members, maybe a few other well-wishers. But Brandon had like 200 well-wishers, and the party that he had that night was, well, Debbie was like, I'm feeling a little claustrophobic. No surprise, because I don't know if they anticipated this many people. In any event, it was fun, and it was kind of a momentous occasion for us as a family, but also obviously in view of the larger things happening in the country. So let me turn to those. Let's flash back to January 6th of 2021, when it looked like things were just going really badly for our side. First of all, many of us knew intuitively, it was a long way from me making 2,000 mules or anything like that, but just based upon all the things we had seen, all the indications, it looked quite possible, maybe even probable, that Biden had stolen the 2020 election. Not Biden himself, he's actually incapable of doing it, but some kind of a clever operation on the part of the Democrats. So there was the heist. This is actually what brought people to DC on January 6th of 2021. So first you have the blow of the stolen election. Then you have the double blow, which is that there was a concentrated attempt to blame Trump for January 6th, saying he instigated it, he's responsible for it, these are his people, they're doing his bidding. Why would they go in the Capitol if he didn't want them to go in the Capitol? And so the view on the left among the Democrats in the media was that Trump is finished. He's done. Whatever happens now, whether or not Trump ends up prosecuted, whether or not he ends up impeached a second time, whether or not he ends up in jail, the one thing we can be sure of is he's not making a comeback. Interesting. That was number two, blow number two. And then there's blow number three, which is that having set what I think we can now understand to be a trap for the protesters, for the people who came to DC, hey, come in the Capitol. Hey, we're high-fiving you along the way. But, you know, unknown to you, we've got all these undercover agents. The idea is to lure you into the trap and then snap it shut. And snap it shut here doesn't mean locking down the Capitol, but rather spending the next 4 years prosecuting all of you. So not just going after Trump, but going after the Trumpsters. And we've been seeing this in a dismaying way going on for 4 years now. And the plight of these January 6 defendants is horrific and it's really tragic to behold. Debbie and I have been pretty close to it. We've seen it up close in several particular cases. We've tried to help in any way we can, but also recognize that the magnitude of the problem is very large. And yet here we are. Exactly 4 years later, January 6th of 2025, and Trump has really done it, which is to say he has beaten the lawfare, he has beaten the odds, he beat the Democrats in the election, he won the popular vote, a kind of cherry on top of the cake, and quite honestly, a surprise. I mean, who would have, if you were on one of these betting sites like Polymarket, would you have put money on the probability that Trump would win the popular vote? You might have thought Trump would win the election. And many people, me included, thought Trump would win the election. But I did not have confidence that Trump would win the popular vote. Who did? I'd like to know someone who can show me in advance that they thought this was going to happen, that they predicted it. It's easy to say, well, yeah, I knew that he would, Dinesh. I called it. No. Let's see some evidence from before the election that you recognize that this was something that was going to happen. I think many people didn't even think it could happen. Now Trump is in a position to pardon the January 6th captives, and I hope he pardons all of them. Why? Because all of them had their civil rights violated. All of them have been victims of this organized, ruthless, not so much prosecution as persecution. All of them are, in one respect or another, political prisoners. So Trump needs to do this and also do it fast. I'm hoping that we see a lot of shock and awe on January 20th. I'm pretty sure we are going to. And it's going to come at such a pace and be so comprehensive, I think that the left is going to be dizzy. It's almost like when you have multiple targets and you don't know what to go after, they're not even going to know what to object to, because so much is going. It's like force feeding them with a fire hose, and this is exactly what needs to happen. They have richly earned this kind of treatment. It's not normal Republican behavior. It's not what Reagan did. It's not what George W. Bush did, but it is what the situation calls for now. And recently I saw Van Jones being interviewed by a left-wing media type who said to Van Jones, by the way, is also on the left, said something like, "Oh, this foolish Donald Trump," and Van Jones just interrupted him and said, "Hey, wait. We need to stop this." And he went on to say, "Trump is actually smarter than me. He's smarter than you. He's smarter than all the Democrats put together." And Van Jones goes, "You know how I know this? Because not only is he the 47th president-elect, now, of course, the president, but he has the House, he has the Senate, he has the Supreme Court. He has built an entire media ecosystem, a new media ecosystem around him. Even the mainstream media doesn't have enough of a reach to be able to get him. And he did those things. How dumb can he be? How dumb can he be?" And so with this thought, I think we are bracing for really effective action to come in 2025. It's going to be an exciting year. Increased tariffs on our trade partners, tax cuts, regulation changes. Learn why gold is a viable diversification tactic now more than ever. Birch Gold, the only gold company I endorse, is releasing their ultimate guide for gold in the Trump era with a foreword by Donald Trump Jr. To get your free copy along with Birch Gold's free information kit on gold, text my name, Dinesh, to this number, 989898. Here are the facts. The national debt continues to increase. Interest payments on the national debt continue to increase. Gold is still your hedge against a weakened dollar, and Birch Gold is the company I recommend to help you convert an existing IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold. Get ready for the new year. Text Dinesh to 989898. You get a free copy of the ultimate guide for gold in the Trump era. There's no obligation, just information. With an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers, you too can turn to Birch Gold. Text Dinesh to the number 989898 today.
Just like all of you, I had problems sleeping. I had tried every pillow out there and nothing worked. I'd flip-flop all night, use my arm for support, and fall asleep, or I'd wake up with a sore neck or maybe a headache. Well, quality sleep comes from keeping your neck straight at night. You have to fill in that space between your head and your bed. That's why I invented MyPillow. MyPillow's patented fill adjusts to your exact individual needs, and it doesn't matter if you sleep on your back, stomach, side, or any combination of all three.
When I got MyPillow, I'm asleep almost immediately. I stay asleep at night, and I wake up more well-rested in the morning.
So go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get Classic King MyPillows for only $19.98. Queen size just $18.98. Standard Classic MyPillows only $14.98. That's right, only $14.98. Plus all orders $75 or more ship absolutely free.
Guys, I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast someone who is an expert on terrorism and threats to our national security. It's John Guandolo. He's a former FBI agent. He's a fellow at the Claremont Institute. He graduated from U.S. Naval Academy, served in the Marine Corps, also 13 years in the FBI, where he developed counterterrorism programs focusing on jihadi networks. So all very topical, all very important. You can follow him on X at jguandolo54271 or the website, johnguandolo.com. John, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. I want to talk to you about the threat of terrorism inside of America. Now, we had a couple of incidents which were initially both attributed to terrorism. It could be that just one of them was, namely the attack in New Orleans. The other one, of course, was a strange incident of a Tesla exploding outside the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas. Maybe I can start by asking you just to comment on those incidents themselves, but then I want to move to talk about whether we're facing a much broader problem in this country.
So thanks, Dinesh, for having me as always. I think by speaking about what happened in New Orleans particularly actually answers your broader question. Because if we look at what happened, how the leadership prior to the event in the areas responded, and left a significant jihadi network unattended, it really talks to that question of how bad things are here. So let's first talk about the incident itself. We have in the build up to this, of course, the call for individual jihad, and the again emphasis on using things like vehicles, personal weapons for individual jihad, which is a form of jihad in Islamic law. We see in Germany the Christmas market attacked with a vehicle. We see right after this happens in New Zealand, another Muslim does the same thing that happened in New Orleans. And we see what happens in New Orleans as a Muslim drives a vehicle into a crowd, gets out, shoots people, is shot dead. So you've got the individual call for jihad, the actions not only in the United States, in other areas. And by the way, I just saw, I think 2 days ago, we had in Idaho a man arrested for planting an IED on the railroad tracks. And the story kind of was small to begin with and disappeared. So we're still researching that. But the point is, these things are happening. We have a guy who's from Houston, Texas, a Muslim jihadi from Houston, Texas, within about 2 minutes walking distance of the Masjid Bilal, which is the name of the mosque. And that mosque is controlled by the Islamic Society Greater Houston, which is a Hamas Muslim Brotherhood organization. But more to the point, it's owned by the Islamic Society Greater Houston, is a subsidiary of the Islamic Society in North America, which is a significant Muslim Brotherhood organization, the largest terrorism financing trial ever successfully prosecuted in American history, identifies ISNA not only as a Muslim Brotherhood organization, but an organization that directly funds the designated terrorist organization Hamas. So that's number one. Number two, if you look at the jihadi network, the terrorist network in Texas, where this guy's from, you have more jihadi attacks in Texas than any other state. You got the number 2 hub for Hamas in Texas and Dallas. You have the largest terrorism financing trial ever prosecuted in American history, was prosecuted in Dallas, Texas. These are all indicators of a real problem in Texas. Now let's flip back to, and by the way, what has the leadership in Texas done about the massive jihadi network in Texas? Nothing. Go back to Louisiana. 8 years ago, myself and a colleague briefed the Attorney General of Louisiana, who's now the governor of Louisiana, about the network. He understood it, but he decided to take no action. And now that's, again, blown up, and this isn't the first issue in Louisiana. It's blown up in his face. These 2 governors are Republicans. So the issue of the broader network in all 50 states is that no governor has taken any action in the last 20 years to deal with the network from which these jihadis are born. So they've got we can track from 9/11 to Boston to Fort Hood to Chattanooga to this attack in New Orleans. These attacks have the support one way or the other from this identifiable jihadi network that is massive, thousands of organizations. And so we not only have an incompetent FBI who at the outset of this said this isn't terrorism, and then of course has to backtrack and say, well, it is terrorism. But the FBI has no open cases on this network. The DHS is not doing anything about the network, and none of the 50 governors is doing anything about the network. And the American people are left holding the bag. So I think that, to me, is what we can at least highlight as a result of this horrific tragedy in Louisiana.
John, if I think back to 9/11, that was something of a centrally directed operation. Obviously, it was organized by bin Laden and his associates. It was using a vehicle, but the airplane, as its sort of weapon of choice. Are you saying that since that, and since some of the measures that have been taken to prevent those kinds of attacks from occurring, you have a more decentralized jihadi operation, almost franchised out to local franchisees? Hey, listen, use your automobile, use your backpack, use your own local toolkit, if you will, to carry out these attacks. Is that happening? And second of all, how do you explain the puzzle that you yourself just described, namely Republican governors who are not in the dark? In one case, as you mentioned, you briefed him. Why would they take this path of inaction?
Okay, so those are two really important questions that need to be answered. So first, I'll answer the last one first. In my experience, the vast majority of people that take no action do so out of for selfish reasons. They want to hit the next rung on the ladder. In the case of Louisiana governor, I mean, his explanation of not doing anything right in the moment was, if I do anything about this, I'll never, my political career will be over. And as an attorney general of a state, I think that's a horrible response to not addressing a real and imminent threat when you have plenty of legal basis to do so. I mean, in my book, Raising a Jihadi Generation, at the back of the book, I put in there a boilerplate affidavit. So it's done. If you're an attorney general or you're a detective or something, I mean, the work's been done, and the evidence is significant of the network and the organizations that are easily a part of it. So that's the first part. Now, as far as the attacks and the tactical and strategic decisions of who and how to attack, it's not a binary. The question isn't binary. It's both. So you still have, at the international level, a very well coordinated effort down to the local level, and we're talking about the United States here, in the United States. So you have organizationally, whether it's Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Hamas, and others, to include Hezbollah and the Iranian threat here in the United States, those cells that operate being trained and directed at a higher level. But you also have the call for individual jihad that is being carried out and continues to be. We've had hundreds of attacks in the United States, some very minor, where people are just wounded, but these are still jihadi attacks. And often, because local law enforcement has been so poorly trained or not trained at all to understand this, they don't know what they have. And I'll give you one very real practical example. I worked for a number of years in Arizona. We happened to have an incredible prosecutor in Maricopa County at the time, who ordered all of the attorneys in the prosecutor's office to go through our training. So we were actually back in the Phoenix area multiple times. And there was an attack. A Muslim shows up at a police department in Fountainhead, says he wants to talk to somebody. And this is on video. It's out there for the public to see. The sheriff's deputy shows up, and the Muslim starts throwing rocks at the sheriff's deputy. And the deputy's like, what in the world are you doing? And then the individual pulls out a knife and charges the deputy and is shot. Well, because the prosecutors in Maricopa realized what this was, it got prosecuted under state terrorism laws that were enacted because I briefed the legislators who then worked with prosecutors who understood what this was, enacted the law, and the state took it. Now, they offered it to the FBI, who said, no, this is just some crazy guy throwing rocks. And they're like, thank you, we'll take it. They prosecuted it. And when the FBI realized what it was too late and wanted to take it back, the leaders in Arizona told them to pound sand. My point is, when you actually understand what you've got in front of you, it's not some crazy guy who just ran over a few people, right? In instances that we've had in places like Arizona and California, and the local police just treat it like it's nothing, and the local prosecutors just say, oh, it's just some crazy guy running over. But when you talk to witnesses and they say, no, he was screaming Allahu Akbar while he was plowing over people, it changes what you know you have. But when you have federal agents, state and local police who aren't trained, they don't know that. And the final point to this is, at the end of the 3-day law enforcement training that I conduct and my team conducts, I always ask 2 questions. Raise your hands if you knew this before you came in here. And when we have FBI agents from the Counterterrorism Division or task force officers from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, or name the organization, no hands will go up. But when I ask the second question, do you believe, raise your hand if you believe this information is critical to protecting your community, everyone raises their hands. And they are angry because they say things like, how is it I've been in the Counterterrorism Division for 8 years and have never heard this information, that I'm training them? And it's because, well, the people who don't want you to get the information, your Islamic advisors at the FBI, the DHS, they absolutely will tell you you don't need that. That's why I'm here.
Wow.
And funny, this information that's critical to protecting communities like New Orleans and other places doesn't get out there to these local police.
John, when we come back, I want to pick it up in this next segment and ask you about the radicalization process. Every new year, we spend a few days thinking about what we can do to improve our lives, and usually it revolves around better health, right? I want to strongly encourage you to do what I do. Take responsibility for your health by taking this. It's Balance of Nature. It's fruit and veggies in a capsule. It's Balance of Nature's whole food ingredient supplement. Seriously, they're packed with 31 varieties of fruit and vegetable ingredients, from tomatoes to sweet potatoes, and just about everything in between. This is a resolution you can truly keep all year long, like I do. This is your last time to put it off, because today you can become a preferred customer at Balance of Nature. Use my discount code. It's America. You get 35% off, free shipping, plus a free fiber and spice supplement. This is an unbelievable limited New Year's promotion, but you got to use my discount code America. Here's the number to call, 800-246-8751. Again, it's 800-246-8751, or go to balanceofnature.com. Use discount code America, get 35% off plus free fiber and spice supplement.
This past year has been one of the hardest in MyPillow's history. It's because of you that we're making it through. My employees and I want to thank you for your continued support by extending our wholesale prices on classic MyPillows. Get standard classic MyPillows only $14.98. I can't believe I'm even saying that. Only $14.98. But it gets even better. Upgrade to a queen size MyPillow for just $18.98. King size only $1 more. Get my body pillows $29.98 and multi-use My Pillows for only $9.98. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to take advantage of these wholesale prices, including my standard size My Pillow, originally $49.98, now only $14.98. Queens, $18.98. Kings, only $1 more. Not only that, order $75 or more, ship absolutely free.
From all of us here at My Pillow,
I'm back with former FBI agent, fellow at the Claremont Institute, John Guandolo. Follow him on X at jguandolo54271 or the website johnguandolo, GUANDOLO.com. John, perhaps the phenomenon of the foreign terrorist who shows up in America is somewhat understandable. They are the product of a completely different regime of indoctrination, of information about America being the great Satan, and so on. Probably to most people more mystifying is the homegrown terrorist, because even if you have a guy of Islamic origin, they're going to go to a public school or to a school with American kids. They're going to enjoy the benefits of American life. Most likely, they're not going to speak with a foreign accent. Now, they might attend the local mosque, but one presumes to think they probably don't spend all their time over there. So I think it's a little baffling how the American-born Muslim becomes sort of radicalized or initiated into jihad. What are the steps that occur for someone to fall into that to the extent that they're willing to become, let's say, a kind of a suicide bomber?
So this is a great question, Dinesh. And there are a couple points I'd like to put on the table and then kind of unpack it. One is, I think it's really important for Americans to understand that what's happening in America, and this is true for the communist movement as well, but what's happening in America, these are, when we use, and I think the term is accurate, homegrown, meaning they're born in America and then they become a jihadi. How's that work? But what's really important to remember is that the organizations and the control and the coordination for the jihadi movement in the United States is, for the most part, comes from hostile foreign powers, like the communist movement, for instance, comes from hostile foreign powers, some of whom are nuclear powers, like Pakistan, and on the communist side, China. So we have to understand that we're in a war where these hostile foreign powers are using these organizations in the United States to wage war against us. And that includes some of the mosque network, the Islamic organizations. If you look at the prominent Islamic organizations, you cannot name one national prominent Islamic organization that's not hostile. And this is a problem. And it's not because they, bad guys got a hold of them or created them. It's we can historically look at what's happened. And the kind of 30 to 35 second summary is, you've got the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States builds the Islamic network in the United States, which means, of course, it's going to be hostile. And then you've got primarily the Hamas, which is an inherent part of the Muslim Brotherhood, leads that effort for many years. And then in 2017, Erdogan of Turkey officially and formally takes charge of the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood network. So you now literally have a hostile foreign power, Turkey, running it. So it doesn't mean that across the board, and this is important, that everyone, as you said, who identifies as being a Muslim is hostile. But the chance of someone growing up in that community becoming hostile is very high because of the fact that the organizational networks and the communities are oriented towards that. And that's why we see, and that's why you can look at things like the Pew polls or the Sharia, the mosque surveys here in the United States. A large percentage of Muslims in the United States, a majority for sure, will side with these kinds of activities that are going on. So it's a much bigger problem than we are giving it credence to. But you alluded to it. These networks, these organizations are built to indoctrinate. So I prefer that when we look at what the law enforcement realm calls the radicalization process, is actually the process of Islamic indoctrination through these known networks, whether it's the mosque or Islamic school indoctrination, which we teach out of the books that they use here in the United States, whether it be something like What Islam is All About, which is used to teach junior high school students in U.S. Islamic schools about Islam. And when you read it, it teaches exactly what Al-Qaeda teaches about Islam. And I'll quote you off the top of my head, the duty of the Muslim citizen is to be loyal to the Islamic State, right? That the law of the land is the Sharia of Allah, and Muslims they're obliged to obey that. So their loyalty, they're taught, their loyalty in the United States is to Sharia and to the Ummah, to the Islamic community. We've got two of the biggest Islamic organizations in the United States, the Islamic Circle in North America, the Muslim American Society, published a training guide which says that the Islamic community must wage war until Allah's law is imposed on all people. So that's what's there. And that's why when I teach this and people critique what I and my organization teach, I just say, I'm teaching out of their stuff. I'm teaching out of Islamic law. I'm teaching out of the junior high textbooks. I'm teaching out of the training guides used to train at the biggest Islamic organizations in America. So if you're going to critique something, you should begin your critique with looking at what's being taught to Muslims in America. But I think what you're hitting on is incredibly important, because we know, and you know this, you've actually spoken about this when we talk about the psychology, right, of ideologies and things like that. If you teach 100 people a very hostile organization, we know that it is highly probable that there is a pretty good percentage of those people that will absorb it, and then there's a percentage of that will act on it. And that's what we're seeing, not only in the United States, in Europe and elsewhere.
John, what is the connection, if any, of a porous border to all of this? I ask because even though in the latest case you have a guy who was an American born here, it would seem to me that if I'm Iran or I'm Al-Qaeda or I am any one of these organizations, I would say to myself, what a wonderful opportunity to dispatch hordes of operatives into the country, if not to be terrorists themselves, then to sort of cultivate the terrorist network, to replenish the network and make it stronger. I would assume, I want to ask you, has this been going on, and at what kind of a scale? And do you think finally that the Biden administration kind of knows about it, but is looking the other way because it wants an open border for other reasons?
I think, Dinesh, this is why I appreciate the discussion with you. I think you have such a good heart and such an open mind, and you do understand these things. I believe the administration, all the evidence points to this is being done intentionally. I look at the fact that Mr. Biden had an Islamic advisor, Farouk Mitha, who's a Hamas operative, Maher Bitar, who's the director of intelligence for the National Security Council, is a Hamas operative. You can only attribute ignorance and cluelessness. It only goes so far. To answer your question directly, I think it is incredible the numbers of jihadis and other nefarious people that are being brought into this country or allowed to come into this country. We saw not long after 9/11, and at the time, FBI Director Mueller actually testified to the fact that we had jihadis coming across the border who were learning just enough Spanish that they were posing as if they're from Central or South America. And we knew they were jihadis, and that's when we were actually trying to control the border. You are correct. And it's whether it's Iran or Yemen or, Saudi Arabia and other countries that are sending jihadis across the border, they're coming. And they're coming in large number. And so when you recognize the large number of organizations, Islamic organizations that are hostile, that are truly jihadi organizations, and the army they've already built here through what we just talked about, through U.S.-born people and some not U.S.-born, but who have come here to do damage and are leaders in these organizations. And then you add on to this millions of people who are crossing our border. And we know, based on a sampling of people who have either been caught or identified, interviewed, and then allowed to come into the country, and then later we're like, oh, whoops, they're on the terrorist watch list. You extrapolate that into the kind of numbers that I think we're seeing. They are augmenting the already present jihadi army here. And I would expect, with regards to the question that I think is being begged to be answered, why aren't they doing even bigger attacks? Well, I can tell you from the intel we have, they're planning larger scale attacks, and they are deciding with the new Trump administration, because we've already got bad guys that are in that circle that are already influencing how the problem will be handled. They're deciding, do we go full violence, or do we still have enough influence in the new administration that we can wait them out 4 years and then unleash kind of the final battle? And that's the decision-making process right now that's going on.
Very scary stuff. Guys, I've been talking to John Guandolo, former FBI agent, fellow at the Claremont Institute. Follow him on X, J Guandolo, 54271, or the website johnguandolo.com. John, I got to have you back to talk more about this, but thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Dinesh. Appreciate being on with you.
I took a break from discussing the big lie for a few days, partly on account of travel last week, but I want to pick it up today. And where we left off, we're drawing close parallels, comparisons, analogies between things happening on the left and in the Democratic Party in America and things that are happening in the fascist and Nazi world in Italy, in Germany, and other parts of Europe. And I want to hone in on a specific comparison because it's a comparison that illustrates my point, while nevertheless at first glance appearing to be kind of far-fetched or implausible. And the comparison is between slave camps and Nazi camps. In other words, it's between what the Democratic Party was doing to the slaves in the American South and what the Nazis were doing with captives, many Jews, but also many of them non-Jewish, in the concentration camps. And I'm going to argue that there's an eerie similarity between the two. Now, many years ago, a brilliant American scholar of slavery named Stanley Elkins revolutionized the field of studying slavery with a book in which he began with a kind of puzzle. And it is that he said, when I study slavery, I discover all these kind of stereotypes about slaves that are not stereotypes that were invented later, but they go back to the slavery era itself. The stereotype of the submissive, childish slave, often called the Sambo figure. Sambo is this guy with and you see caricatures of it even now in historical accounts. Sambo is this kind of overgrown kid. Even though Sambo might be 30 years old, nevertheless, he's always shuffling and truckling and submitting to the master, and he seems to be almost a cartoonish, submissive character, the Sambo figure. And then there's also the opposite of Sambo, which is the rebellious, the angry, sometimes called the field Negro in the days of slavery. This is the guy who who cannot be made to work, who wants to burn down the plantation. This is the guy who wants to run away, organize a slave revolt. So Stanley Elkins, the American scholar, scratched his head and he said, well, are these stereotypes like somehow made up? Are they fictional? Are they pure inventions? And his answer was no. Stereotypes don't really survive if they are radically made up. They survive usually because there is a grain of truth in them, or often more than a grain of truth. In other words, they depict a reality that they might exaggerate, but nevertheless the reality is still there. And then Elkins began to think about something he had read about the Nazi concentration camps, which was that Nazi captives, again, some of them Jewish, but not all of them, would sort of lose their personality. They would become almost childlike in their dependency upon the Nazis. They would begin to regurgitate Nazi talk. They would become little Nazis themselves. So Stanley Elkins goes, that is in fact the Nazi equivalent of the Sambo character in American slavery. Elkins learned further that there were Jews as well as other captives who agreed to work for the Nazis. They became prison functionaries. They would oversee the actions that were going on inside the camp under the supervision of the German SS personnel. And some of them became even harsher than the Nazis. They assumed the role of the oppressor. And so again, Elkins goes, wow, I'm seeing these weird similarities. On the slave plantation, you hear about black overseers who are appointed by the master. They run the plantation with the same strictness as the master, in some cases even more so. And then here we go in the Nazi concentration camp. It's pretty much the same deal. So what Elkins is really saying, I think, is that the conditions in the slave camp and the Nazi camp are perhaps similar enough to create similar personalities. Now, this is in my view, just a very sharp insight. And Elkins doesn't really develop it because he says, look, I'm not really going to go into the conditions of the Nazi camp. And I think the reason he said that is because he didn't know what those were. He never studied Nazi camps. He was an expert and a scholar of American slavery. So he didn't want to push the analogy too far. But this is kind of where I come in, because I know a lot more about the Nazi camps, and I'm going to push the analogy further beyond Elkins to show you how really powerful it is. So let's just think for a minute about a Nazi concentration camp and a slave camp and see how they are very much the same. First of all, both of them have a kind of ramshackled main building. A slave cabin on the one case, on the other case, a sort of barracks. And inside the barracks, what do you have? You have a workshop, you have a sort of administrative office, you have an infirmary, you have a jail, and then you have a burial place, a kind of a cemetery. In the slave quarters, it's pretty much the same. You have a workshop, very often for work that was going on around the plantation. You have sleeping quarters, you have an administrative office, that's where all the accounts of the plantation are kept. You may not have a formal infirmary, but obviously some medical services are provided. You don't need a jail because you use the tools of jails to tie people up and to lock them up in some cases. And finally, slaves are ultimately buried also on the plantation. In both cases, the slaves and the Nazi captives are given food, often inadequate food, but nevertheless food to keep them going. The food is often monotonous and dull. It's low in high-quality ingredients. Elie Wiesel says that when he was in Auschwitz, he was also later Buchenwald. He goes, basically, I get a bowl of soup every day and crusts of stale bread. That's not that far off from what the slaves were fed. Slaves often got meat, but typically only on the weekend. Notice that the slave camp and the Nazi concentration camp are both isolated from the outside world. Slaves rarely left the plantation. Sometimes they did to go to a neighboring plantation, but that was another sort of camp. Let's look at the routines of work. In both cases, it's work, work, work with very little, quote, time off. Slave labor was continuous labor. After all, you're the property of the master, so you work all day. And in the Nazi camp, it's kind of the same thing. Here's Elie Wiesel again. He says they made him work construction, quote, where 12 hours a day I hauled heavy slabs of stone. You can imagine a slave doing pretty much the same thing. Very often the work was manual, unskilled. In a few cases, it was lightly skilled. You have some carpenters, some masons, and so on. In both cases, of course, the captives are forced to work. The slaves are forced to work. The Nazi captives are forced to work. Now, what protected the slaves weirdly against the Nazi captives is that the slaves had monetary value. This seems like a very weird thing to say, but it turns out to be true. The slaves were property, and property has value. Now, this is not to say that the Nazi captives weren't property also, but the key point is that they were someone else's property in a manner that I'm about to explain. Let's talk about the slaves first. By and large, slaves initially, in the early days, cost $200 or $300 a piece. You could go to a slave auction, buy a guy for $300. But as time went on, slaves became more expensive, partly because Congress had outlawed the importation of more slaves from Africa. So by the 1830s, slaves were worth about $800 on average. And by 1860, when the Civil War began, a slave was worth somewhere between $1,200 and $2,000, a great deal of money in those days. And so think about it. Are you going to go around maiming your slave, killing your slave? Well, first of all, killing your slave was illegal in every slave state. But of course, you could get away with it as a master because you just have to say the slave insulted me, attacked me, and I was forced to do this. So in practice, masters had almost absolute power over the slaves. But the point I'm trying to make is because the slaves were expensive. People are not going to go around maiming your slave for the same reason you're not going to go around bashing your own car. Your status, the slave status as property, paradoxically, provided a certain veneer, at least a thin reed of protection. Now, as I mentioned, the Nazi captives were also property, but whose property? Not the property of the people running the camp. They were the property of the German state. And so the guys running the camp didn't particularly care. They could treat these captives however they wanted because it wasn't their property. They had nothing to gain from it. Finally, let's talk about runaways and revolts. And the simple truth in both cases is there were hardly any of these. Not to say that there weren't any slave runaways, there were, but the South, the Democratic South, had an elaborate system of catching these runaways and returning them to their masters, often accompanied by massive floggings and captivity. So runaways did occur, but not that many of them. Similarly, try to run away from a German concentration camp. It's almost impossible. A few hundred people did that over the tens and hundreds of thousands who were in those camps. Very rare. Slave revolts, you can look through the entire corpus of American history. There are probably 6 or 7 slave revolts of varying magnitude. Honestly, none of them were successful. So there were no real successful slave revolts in the United States in the entire history of slavery. There were successful slave revolts elsewhere, places like Haiti and so on. With regard to the Nazis, there were 1 or 2 attempted revolts, usually of a fairly minor nature. One at a camp called Treblinka, another one at Sobibor in 1943. There was even a small revolt at Auschwitz, all of them ruthlessly suppressed. And so the lesson from this is really simple, that these forms of totalitarianism can only be overthrown from the outside. And sure enough, slavery was destroyed in 1865 by the Union armies and by the Republican Party. And similarly, the Nazi state was destroyed by the United States and, to be honest, the Soviet Union and the Allies. In both cases, the overthrow came, as it had to come, from the outside.
Subscribe to the Dinesh D'Souza podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or watch on Rumble, YouTube, and SalemNow.com.